Well, hello. It's so good to be with you. Of course, I'm really sad that we're not meeting in person and that we don't get to have the chat and the interaction that would happen that way. But what a privilege for me to be able to join with you still, all the way down in the south of England, sitting at my kitchen table. And I'm really delighted to be able to talk with you and to look with you at this absolutely crucial topic of climate change, of the climate crisis that we are faced with today. And thank you to you and thank you to the organisers of this day together. Thank you for choosing this topic because it is so important, and I'm going to touch on why that is. I've called my talk this morning Rising to the Challenge, and I'm going to look at four things around rising to the challenge of the climate crisis. I'm going to look at the I'm going to look at how this is a challenge that we have to rise to. This is a challenge that we are called to rise to. It's a challenge that we can rise to. And then finally, how can we rise to that challenge? So firstly, this is a challenge that we have to rise to. This is something that we absolutely cannot ignore for the sake of people, living in poverty, and for the sake of the wider natural world. At Tearfund, we hear every day how the climate crisis is devastating the lives of people living in poverty. They're experiencing more frequent droughts and floods, which mean that their crops are ruined, people are going hungry, people are losing their homes and their jobs, children are missing out on education. Millions of people are being forcibly displaced by weather-related hazards. And in 2016, we actually saw world hunger increase for the first time in a decade. We've been making good progress on world hunger. That now has been reversed, and we're now seeing world hunger increase. And climate change is one of the key reasons for that. Actually, climate change alongside conflict, and of course the two are often very closely linked. So I think of Orbisa, a mother of a large family in the Afar region of northeastern Ethiopia, where climate change is having a terrible effect on her life and on the lives of the community that she's in. They used to expect rain for up to 4 months a year, but now it only falls in August. So people don't have enough water to survive. And Orbisa has to walk for 10 hours every day to collect water from a lake. And even that water isn't sufficient for what they need. I think of Jessie, a grandmother from Malawi, who finds herself struggling to provide for her children and her grandchildren because her husband and one of her sons and her daughter-in-law have all died of HIV. Jessie's village is in Malawi and it's close to a river, and her house has been ruined twice recently by flooding. They suffer from hunger because they rely on their maize crops to provide the food that they need and to give her some sort of livelihood for the extra maize that she's able to sell. But those crops are being destroyed when the rains come in a way that they're not expected to come, and flooding happens. And so she is being pushed further and further into poverty. Jessie and Orbisa are just two examples of the many, many, many lives that are being terribly impacted by our climate crisis. We've seen it recently with extreme poverty and starvation and hunger in South Sudan. We've seen it in Haiti when a hurricane has come in over those who are trying to recover from the earthquake. Climate change is ruining people's lives. And of course, the wider environment is facing a crisis too. Our human activities are fundamentally altering the whole creation. a major intergovernmental UN report a couple of years ago found that 66% of marine environments and 75% of land environments have been changed because of us. And climate change is one of the key drivers behind this, and linked in with with all of the other drivers as well. And this has terrible consequences as ecosystems are collapsing and species are going extinct at a terrifying rate. David Attenborough has said that the planet I saw as a young man has now changed beyond recognition. The recent heat waves in northwestern Canada and off the western coast of Canada, they think caused 1 billion marine creatures to die. You know, ecosystem collapse, biodiversity loss, these sound very scientific, don't they? But they come down to 1 billion marine creatures dying because of the recent heat wave. That's absolutely tragic. And we see millions of people whose lives are being wrecked because of the climate crisis. So we know this first point, this is a challenge that we have to rise to. And secondly, it's a challenge that we as Christians, as people of faith, as people who follow God, we are called to rise to, because it comes the climate crisis stands right at the heart of our Christian faith. We believe in a creator God. We believe in a God who created this world, looked at it and said, it is very good. It's fantastic. God doesn't look at this world and think, oh, it'll do. It's a bit rubbish until I can think of something better. There's no picture in the Bible of God thinking that this world is going to be destroyed and we're going to be whisked off and spend the rest of our days in some floaty heaven. The picture of the future that we get very much mirrors the creation. The picture of the future that we get in Revelation is earthy, it's physical. It's one of heaven and earth being reunited and transformed. So this world fundamentally has been made by God, and he loves it. This world is absolutely valuable to him. So therefore, as people who love God, don't we want to look after and love and cherish that which is most valuable to him? Colossians 1:15-20 tells us that this world was made in Jesus and by Jesus, for Jesus and through Jesus. There's some deep Christological stuff that's happening here where we think about creation. It's not that we have God as creator over here and God as saviour over here. Salvation in Jesus, salvation and creation are deeply intertwined. This world has been created in Jesus, and he died. That passage goes on to say, his blood was shed on the cross to reconcile all things to him. So the good news of salvation, the gospel, yes, is about individuals having their relationship with God restored. But actually, if we stop there, we have a truncated and an emaciated gospel. The full gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, as we see in Colossians, is that Jesus' blood on the cross has brought about the reconciliation of all things to God. So God made this world and he loves it. God has a future for this world and he calls us to be a part of it. And we have been created to look after the rest of what God has made. We've been created in God's image to represent God, to be his ambassadors. With the force of Genesis 1:26-28 is really that we are the final species created explicitly with the purpose of looking after everything else. We are here to rule, but not to rule oppressively. We are here to rule over the rest of creation as servants, as servant rulers. And when we look in the scriptures, we see that running all the way through is a clear call to justice, a clear call to be responding to the needs of those who are living in poverty. A clear call, again, coming out of this idea that all people are made in the image of God. A clear call that poverty is absolutely wrong, is absolutely not what God has intended. If all people are made in God's image, how can we settle for a situation where some people have more than they need and others are living in abject poverty? Isaiah 58 calls us to spend ourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed. And that's what we are called to do. That's the role that we play as followers of a God of justice. We are called, when we see the impact that the climate crisis is having on people in poverty, we are called to respond and to take action. How can we not? How can we not rise to this challenge as people who worship a God of justice and who follow the Lord of all creation? So this is a challenge that we must rise to. The latest IPCC report at the beginning of August just laid out again the huge challenge that's in front of us. We must respond to it. It's a challenge that we are called to respond to right from the heart of our Christian faith. Thirdly, it's a challenge that I think we can respond to. I want you to look back over the last 18 months or more. Incredibly hard, weren't they? But we did respond. And you responded. You responded personally. You responded in your churches as church congregations and as church leaders. You responded. You did what the church is called to be, responding to the needs of the communities around you, whether it's through food banks or offering grief counselling services or whatever it might have been. As a church, we did respond. And there's encouragement for me with this to say that we are resilient, we are creative, we're amazing. We can respond when we see an emergency. Look at how we responded to COVID-19, and we can respond to this as well. COVID has shown us that when we are faced with an emergency, we can adapt, we can change, and we can do something about it. And you are starting to do something about it in Scotland. Your government is responding. In spring of 2019, Scotland, you declared a climate emergency. You set out world-leading legislation, setting a target date for net zero emissions by 2045, and you've set an interim target for reductions of at least 75% by 2030. The Scottish Government has got strong climate ambitions, they're really to be welcomed. But as I'm sure you know, that ambition now needs to be matched by clear targets, policy frameworks, and by urgent timescales that actually say when these things are going to be delivered. But they show me that you can act. You can rise to the challenge. And as churches, over the last year, we've seen a greater awareness of climate change as an important issue, really across the board for the main denominations in Scotland. But you are not leading in this area. You are taking steps. In the Baptist Union, there's a public theology group which is working with the General Director to coordinate the union's response to political and social and ethical developments. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Laura Young, sits on this group and brings her passion and her expertise on climate change to that. So there are things that you are doing. which gives me encouragement that together we can rise to this challenge. And then finally, how can we rise to the challenge? Well, there are things that we can do in our churches. I would really encourage you to take time building in an understanding in your congregations of the biblical basis around responding to climate change and teaching on the connection between the climate crisis and poverty, and help people to see how this comes directly out of our worship of a God who calls us to respond to the needs of people living in poverty. There are some great resources that we've developed at Tearfund. You can find them really easily up on the Tearfund website. If you go to the homepage, click along the top, there are drop down menus, and you'll very easily find one that takes you to our climate change resources. In fact, while I'm talking, someone might be able to find that link and just put it in the chat there. I really recommend to you a 9-part series by or with Catherine Hayhoe, who's an absolutely brilliant Canadian climate scientist and Christian, and she's put together a study series called Christianity and Climate Change. In between are the 2 weeks of COP. In that middle weekend, there's going to be a COP26 church service, and I've with brilliant resources there, and I really recommend you click on that link and sign your church up to that. And if you're in a church that's wanting to take more in-depth action around this, then do also look at the climate emergency toolkit that's there. And finally, for resources, check out my books. I've written a lot on this issue. I've written on how we can respond in our lives and in our churches. Have a look particularly at L is for Lifestyle and Saying Yes to Life. And you can find that very easily if you go onto my website, where you can just put my name in and you'll find my website and look at the publications, the drop down menu there. And again, while I'm saying this, someone might like to look at that and find it and put it in the chat for us. So there's lots of resources out there to help you to rise to the challenge. This is a challenge we absolutely have to rise to. We cannot ignore it. It's a challenge that we are called to rise to because it comes from the heart of our Christian faith. It's a challenge that we can rise to. To do that, we need to act together as individuals, as governments and businesses. We need to act together. And I've pointed you to some resources that will help you as individuals and you in your churches to do that. So let us rise to the challenge. We can be an example to our communities and to our nations. We can lead the way on this. Let us together pray, use our money well, take action, and let's together rise to the challenge of the climate emergency. So bless you today. I know you've got other sessions. You're going to have some brilliant things. You'll have an opportunity to chat, to discuss, to ask questions, to look more practically at things that you can be doing. But I'll be praying for you today that it is a real day of inspiration and motivation, and that you might leave today with very clear pathways to action as to how you and your churches can rise to the challenge.